The night Eleanor Osgood pricked her finger for the third time that evening. She knew her eyes were failing her in the guttering candlelight, but she had no choice except to keep sewing, because Mrs. Henderson needed this quilt by Sunday, and the money would keep Eleanor fed for another 2 weeks. Blood spotted the pale fabric, and she cursed under her breath, sucking on her fingertip while holding the needle away from the delicate pattern she had been working on for hours in her cramped room above the Mercantile in Deeming, New Mexico Territory, in the spring of 1883. She was 22 years old and had been alone in this harsh territory for 3 years, since her father died of fever, and her mother followed him 6 months later from what the doctor politely called a broken heart. But what Eleanor knew was simply the inability to keep fighting when everything worth fighting for was gone. The little homestead they had claimed outside town was sold to pay debts, and Eleanor found herself with nothing but her sewing skills and a stubborn determination not to become one of the painted women who worked in the saloons along Silver Avenue. The candle flickered again, casting wild shadows across the faded wallpaper, and Eleanor set down her work with a frustrated sigh. Her back ached from hunching over, and her eyes burned with fatigue. She stood and stretched, looking out the single window at the darkened street below where a few late-night travelers still moved between the saloons and the hotel. Deeming was a railroad town, rough and growing, full of cowboys, miners, and men looking to make their fortune in silver or cattle or anything else that might pan out in this unforgiving landscape. She had just returned to her sewing when she heard boots on the stairs outside her door. Heavy, measured steps that paused at her landing. Eleanor froze, her heart suddenly hammering. It was nearly midnight, and no decent person had reason to visit a single woman at this hour. She grabbed the scissors from her sewing basket, holding them like a weapon as a knock sounded at her door. "Miss Osgood," the voice was deep, male, and unfamiliar. "I apologize for the late hour. My name is Daniel Grant. Mrs. Henderson sent me." Eleanor approached the door cautiously, keeping the chain latched as she opened it a crack. In the dim hallway light, she could make out a tall figure in a dusty coat and wide-brimmed hat. His face was shadowed, but his posture was respectful, hands visible and empty. "Mrs. Henderson is ill," he continued. "She asked me to bring you something. Said it was important and could not wait until morning." "What could possibly be so important?" Eleanor asked, not opening the door any further. "Madam, I am just following a lady's instructions. She said you are ruining your eyes by candlelight and that she would not have your blindness on her conscience." He held up something that caught the faint light, a metal base with glass chimney. "She sent a proper lamp and oil. Said to tell you the cost of the oil is included in her payment for the quilt, and you are to use it without argument." Eleanor felt her throat tighten with unexpected emotion. Mrs. Henderson was one of the few women in town who treated her with consistent kindness, always paying fairly and on time, sometimes including extra for particularly fine work. She unlatched the chain and opened the door wider, finally getting a proper look at the man who stood before her. Daniel Grant was perhaps 26 or 27, with sun-bronzed skin and dark hair that curled slightly where it touched his collar. His eyes were a startling blue-gray, almost silver in certain lights, and his face had the weathered look of someone who spent most of his time outdoors. He was clean-shaven, and despite the trailed dust on his clothes, had the bearing of a man who took care with his appearance when circumstances allowed. "That is very kind of her," Eleanor said, taking the lamp he offered. It was a beautiful thing, brass and glass, far nicer than the stub of candle she had been working by. "Please tell her I am grateful." "I will tell her in the morning," Daniel said. "I am staying at the hotel for a few days before heading back to my ranch." Mrs. Henderson is my aunt, though I do not see her as often as I should." He tipped his hat. "I will leave you to your work, Miss Osgood. Good night." He turned to go, but Eleanor surprised herself by speaking. "Mr. Grantwaite, would you know how to light this properly? I have never used a lamp quite like this one." It was not entirely true. She had used similar lamps before her family lost everything. But something in her wanted him to stay just a moment longer, to have another minute of conversation with someone who was not asking her for something, or looking at her with pity or speculation about how a young woman alone would eventually fall. Daniel paused and turned back, a small smile playing at his lips as though he knew exactly what she was doing but was gentleman enough not to say so. "It would be my pleasure, madam." He stepped into her small room, immediately making it feel even smaller with his presence. He removed his hat, revealing more of his face, the strong jaw and the small scar above his left eyebrow that spoke of some past injury. His hands were large and work roughened as he took the lamp and showed her how to remove the chimney, trim the wick, and light it properly. "The key is keeping the wick trimmed even," he explained, his voice low and patient. "Too high and it will smoke. Too low and it will not give enough light. You want a steady, clean flame." The lamp blazed to life, flooding the room with warm, steady light that made Eleanor blink after hours of squinting in the gloom. She looked around her room, seeing details she had forgotten existed. The pattern in the wallpaper, the true color of her faded quilt. The face of the man standing before her, which she now saw clearly was kind and somewhat handsome in a rough-hewn way. "This is wonderful," she breathed. "I can actually see." Daniel set the lamp on her small table, adjusting it so the light fell directly on her sewing. "My aunt is right to worry. You will go blind working in the dark like that." He glanced at the quilt, and his expression shifted to something like admiration. "That is beautiful work. My mother used to sew quilts. She passed when I was 16, but I remember watching her piece together scraps and make something fine." "I am sorry for your loss," Eleanor said automatically, then added, "My mother also passed, 3 years ago." "Then we are both orphans of a sort," Daniel said. "Though I suppose at our age we are simply adults without parents, which is the natural way of things." He picked up his hat. "I truly should let you work. Mrs. Henderson was quite specific that you needed this quilt finished, and I have taken enough of your time." "Thank you for bringing the lamp," Eleanor said, "and for showing me how to use it properly." "You are welcome, Miss Osgood." He moved toward the door, then paused once more. "If I may be so bold, my aunt has invited me to Sunday dinner after church. She mentioned you would be delivering the quilt that morning. Perhaps I will see you then." "Perhaps," Eleanor agreed, feeling warmth in her cheeks that had nothing to do with the lamp. After he left, she sat down to her sewing again, but found herself thinking more about the cowboy rancher with the silver-blue eyes than about the stitches she was making. The lamp transformed her work, making it easy and pleasant where it had been a strain. She worked for another 2 hours, making better progress than she had in the previous 6, before finally banking the lamp and falling into bed with a lightness in her heart she had not felt in a very long time. Sunday morning dawned clear and hot, the New Mexico sun already fierce by the time Eleanor dressed in her best calico dress and carefully folded the completed quilt. The pattern was a modified star design, intricate and time-consuming, but the effect was striking. Mrs. Henderson had provided fine fabrics in blues and creams, and Eleanor had added small details that were not required but which she knew would please her patron. The walk to Mrs. Henderson's house on the better side of town took 20 minutes, and Eleanor was perspiring lightly by the time she knocked on the door. Mrs. Henderson herself answered, a plump woman in her 50s with iron-gray hair and shrewd, kind eyes. "Eleanor, "Dear, come in out of that heat," she said, ushering Eleanor into a parlor that was blessedly cool and beautifully furnished. "Let me see what you have made." Eleanor unfolded the quilt across the settee, and Mrs. Henderson made small sounds of pleasure as she examined the stitching, the pattern, the tiny embroidered details in the corners. "This is your finest work yet," she declared. "My daughter will be thrilled. This will be the centerpiece of her hope chest." She went to a small desk and returned with an envelope. "Your payment with a little extra for the exceptional quality." "You already provided the lamp and oil," Eleanor protested. "That is more than generous." "Nonsense. Good work deserves fair payment." "My nephew tells me you did not go blind working by candlelight, so I consider it money well spent." Mrs. Henderson smiled. "Speaking of Daniel, he will be joining us for dinner after church. You will stay, of course. I insist." Eleanor wanted to refuse out of propriety, but the thought of Daniel Grant and a home-cooked meal was too tempting. "If you are certain I would not be imposing." "Imposing? Child, you would be doing me a favor. Daniel needs to meet some decent young people his own age. All he does is work on that ranch of his, and he will turn into a hermit if someone does not intervene." Church was in a simple wooden building that served Deeming's Protestant population. Eleanor sat in her usual spot near the back, but she could see Daniel sitting with his aunt in a middle pew, his broad shoulders unmistakable even from behind. She tried to focus on the sermon, but her attention kept drifting to the rancher, wondering about his life, his ranch, whether he had someone waiting for him there. After the service, Mrs. Henderson collected her nephew and Eleanor with the efficiency of a general marshalling troops. "Come along, both of you. Dinner will not cook itself, though I did most of the preparation yesterday." Daniel offered Eleanor his arm for the walk back to his aunt's house, and she took it, feeling the solid strength of him through his Sunday coat. "I trust the lamp is working well?" he asked. "Wonderfully. I completed the quilt in half the time I expected. Your aunt's gift was truly a blessing." "She has a good heart," Daniel agreed. "Sometimes I think too good for this territory. She should have stayed back east where life is gentler." "Why did she come west?" followed her husband. "He had dreams of silver mining. He found some, enough to build that house and give her a comfortable life, then died in a cave 10 years ago. She stayed because by then Deeming was home." He glanced at Eleanor. "What brought your family to New Mexico?" "My father had dreams of land and cattle. He was a clerk in Ohio, and he wanted something more. He got land but never quite managed the cattle part. Then the fever came and took him, and my mother could not carry on alone." Eleanor heard the bitterness in her own voice. "Dreams are dangerous things in this country." "Sometimes," Daniel agreed. "But sometimes they are the only things worth having." Dinner at Mrs. Henderson's house was a revelation for Eleanor, who had been living on bread and cheese and the occasional egg for months. There was roasted chicken, potatoes with gravy, fresh green beans, biscuits, and for dessert, an apple pie that made Eleanor close her eyes in pleasure at the first bite. "Miss Osgood sews the finest quilts in the territory," Mrs. Henderson told her nephew. "She has orders backed up for months." "Not quite months," Eleanor corrected, "but I have been fortunate to find steady work." "You are too modest," Mrs. Henderson said. "I have seen quilts from El Paso to Santa Fe, and none match your skill." Daniel had been quiet during most of the meal, but now he spoke. "Do you enjoy the work, Miss Osgood?" Eleanor considered the question. "I enjoy creating something beautiful. I enjoy knowing that my quilts will keep families warm, will mark important occasions like weddings and births. But do I enjoy spending 14 hours a day bent over a needle in a small room? Not particularly. It is survival, Mr. Grant. I do what I must." "An honest answer," he said. something like respect in his eyes. Most people dress up their struggles as noble sacrifices. I appreciate the directness. Eleanor has had to be direct to survive, Mrs. Henderson said. This town is not always kind to young women alone. No town is, Daniel said, which is one reason I prefer my ranch. It is honest work with honest results. Cattle do not lie or cheat. They simply live or die based on the choices I make. How large is your ranch? Eleanor asked, genuinely curious. 3,000 acres, about 500 head of cattle right now. I have 2 men who work for me full-time, a few others who come during roundup and branding. It is not a huge operation, but it is mine, paid for with my own work. There was pride in his voice, the satisfaction of a man who had built something from nothing. Daniel started with nothing but a horse and a rope 8 years ago, Mrs. Henderson said. Worked for other ranchers, saved every penny, bought land that no one else wanted because there was no water source. Then he found a spring that previous surveyors had missed, and suddenly his worthless land became valuable. It was not quite that dramatic, Daniel said, but he was smiling. Though I will admit there was some luck involved. After dinner, Mrs. Henderson mysteriously remembered urgent correspondence that needed her attention, leaving Daniel and Eleanor to sit on the porch in the shade. The afternoon heat was oppressive, but a slight breeze made it bearable. My aunt is not subtle, Daniel said after a long silence. No, Eleanor agreed. But she means well, she does. He stretched his long legs out, looking comfortable and relaxed. She worries about me, thinks I am too alone out at the ranch. Are you? Too alone, he thought about that. Sometimes, but I prefer honest solitude to false company. I spent some years working for other men, living in bunkhouses, surrounded by people all the time. I learned that being alone and being lonely are not the same thing. I understand that, Eleanor said. I am alone most of the time, but I do not often feel lonely. Except sometimes at night when I am sewing, and I realize that no one in the world knows or cares whether I finish the quilt or not, whether I prick my finger or go blind or simply disappear. Daniel turned to look at her directly. That is a dark thought, Miss Osgood. Perhaps, but it is the truth of my situation. I have no family, no close friends. I exist on the edges of this town, useful for my skills but not really part of anything. She was not sure why she was being so honest with this man she had just met, except that he had been honest with her first. I care whether you go blind, Daniel said. That is why I brought you the lamp. Your aunt asked you to bring it, she asked. I agreed because I wanted to help. He paused. I saw you once before, about a month ago. You were carrying a heavy bundle of fabric from the mercantile, and you looked so determined and so tired. I almost offered to help, but I lost my nerve. Eleanor felt something flutter in her chest. Why did you lose your nerve? Because you looked like the kind of woman who does not need help from strange cowboys. You looked capable and strong and entirely self-sufficient. I admired that, but also found it intimidating. He smiled slightly. I am not usually a coward, Miss Osgood, but something about you made me hesitate. I am not intimidating, Eleanor protested. I am just trying to survive. You are more than that, Daniel said. You are surviving with grace and skill and dignity. That is admirable. They talked until the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, covering topics that ranged from the practical concerns of ranching and sewing to books they had read and places they had never been, but hoped to see someday. Eleanor learned that Daniel had educated himself by reading everything he could borrow or buy, that he dreamed of breeding better cattle that could thrive in the harsh New Mexico climate, that he missed his younger sister who had married a banker in California and seemed happier in that gentle climate. When Eleanor finally stood to leave, Daniel immediately rose as well. I will walk you home. It is getting late. "That is not necessary," Eleanor began, but he cut her off. "Miss Osgood, I know you are capable of walking yourself home, but I would rest easier knowing you arrived safely, and I would enjoy a few more minutes of your company. If you find my presence objectionable, I will respect your wishes, but I hope you do not." "I do not find your presence objectionable at all," Eleanor admitted. The walk back to her room passed too quickly. The streets of Deeming were busy with Sunday evening activity, families strolling, men heading to saloons, the sounds of a piano drifting from somewhere nearby. Daniel kept up a steady stream of observations and questions that made Eleanor laugh more than she had in months. At the door to the mercantile, Daniel removed his hat. "I return to my ranch tomorrow. It is about 20 miles north of here, near the foothills. I come to town once every few weeks for supplies and to visit my aunt, but I would like permission to call on you when I am in Deeming if you would accept my visits." Eleanor's heart was beating too fast. "I would accept them. I would welcome them. Then I will see you again soon, Miss Osgood." He took her hand and raised it to his lips, a gesture that should have seemed old-fashioned but instead felt perfect. "Thank you for today. It has been one of the finest days I have had in a very long time." "For me as well," Eleanor whispered. She watched him walk away into the gathering dusk, then climbed the stairs to her room where the lamp he had brought her waited like a promise. She lit it carefully, trimming the wick exactly as he had shown her, and sat down to start a new project, a quilt she was making for herself in colors she loved, with no deadline and no pressure. As she sewed by the clear, steady light, she allowed herself to hope for something more than mere survival. Daniel returned to town 2 weeks later on a Thursday afternoon. Eleanor was in the mercantile buying thread when she looked up and saw him entering, dust-covered and weary but smiling when he saw her. "Miss Osgood," he said, removing his hat. "What a pleasant coincidence." "Mr. Grant," she replied, unable to keep the pleasure from her voice. "I did not expect to see you so soon." "I found reasons to come to town," he admitted. "Some supplies that probably could have waited but which I convinced myself were urgent." The mercantile owner, Mr. Peterson, was watching them with undisguised interest, and Eleanor felt color rising to her cheeks. "I was just finishing here. May I walk with you?" They walked through the town, Daniel carrying her small package of thread, talking about the past 2 weeks. He told her about a difficult birth with one of his cows, about repairs to his barn, about his hopes for the fall roundup. She told him about the quilt she was working on, about a difficult client who kept changing her mind about colors, about a book she had borrowed from Mrs. Henderson. "Would you like to see something?" Daniel asked suddenly. "It is a bit of a walk, but the evening is pleasant." Eleanor agreed, and he led her to the edge of town where the buildings gave way to open desert. They walked for perhaps 15 minutes until they reached a small rise. From there, the view was breathtaking. The desert stretched out in all directions, painted gold and rose by the setting sun, the mountains purple in the distance. "I come here sometimes when I am in town," Daniel said. "It reminds me of why I love this territory despite its harshness. There is beauty here if you know how to look for it." "It is beautiful," Eleanor agreed. "Dangerous and difficult, but beautiful." Daniel turned to her. "Miss Osgood, I am not a man of elegant words. I am a rancher who spends most of his time with cattle and horses. But I need you to know that I have not been able to stop thinking about you since we met. You are in my thoughts when I am working, when I am trying to sleep, when I am riding the range. I came to town today not for supplies, but because I needed to see you again." Eleanor's breath caught. "I have been thinking about you as well. Every time I light the lamp, I remember your kindness, but it is more than that. I remember how easy it was to talk to you, how much I enjoyed your company. Then I would like to court you properly," Daniel said. "I know our circumstances are unusual. I live 20 miles from town and you have your work here, but I would like to try if you are willing." "I am willing," Eleanor said. "I am very willing." He took her hand and they stood together watching the sun sink behind the mountains, not speaking, not needing to speak. When darkness began to fall, Daniel walked her back to town, and they made plans for him to visit on Sunday after church. Over the following months, Daniel came to Deeming every week, sometimes twice a week when he could spare the time. They went on long walks, had dinners with Mrs. Henderson, sat on Eleanor's small porch in the evenings talking about everything and nothing. Eleanor learned that Daniel was kind and patient, that he had a dry sense of humor, that he was respected by other ranchers for his honesty and hard work. Daniel learned that Eleanor was stronger than she looked, that she had a sharp mind for business, that she dreamed of having a family but had given up hope of that possibility. One Sunday in late summer, as they sat by the small stream outside town that only flowed during the wet season, Daniel said, "I want to show you the ranch. Would you come? Mrs. Henderson could accompany us as a chaperone." "I would love to see it," Eleanor said immediately. "When?" "Next Sunday, if the weather holds. We can take my wagon. It will be a full day there and back, but I want you to see what I have built. I want you to understand my life." The following Sunday dawned clear and perfect. Mrs. Henderson, Daniel, and Eleanor set out early in Daniel's wagon, Mrs. Henderson providing a running commentary on the passing landscape, while Daniel and Eleanor exchanged glances and small smiles. The journey took several hours, but the time passed quickly. Daniel's ranch was more impressive than Eleanor had imagined. The house was small but solidly built of adobe and wood, designed to stay cool in summer and warm in winter. There was a barn, a bunkhouse for his workers, corrals where horses stood watching their arrival with interest. The land rolled gently toward distant mountains, grass and scrub providing grazing for cattle that dotted the landscape like rust-colored stones. "This is wonderful," Eleanor breathed. "You built all this yourself?" "With help," Daniel said. "But yes, this is 8 years of work." He helped both women down from the wagon. "Let me show you around." He walked them through his domain, showing Eleanor the spring that made everything possible, clear water bubbling up from underground to fill a small pond before flowing down into a creek that watered the southern pastures. He showed her the barn where he kept his best horses, the cows with new calves, the vegetable garden that his men tended with varying success. "It is a hard life," he admitted as they stood looking out over his land. "The weather is brutal, cattle die, prices fluctuate. But it is mine, and I can make it into whatever I am willing to work for." Mrs. Henderson had mysteriously found things to do in the house, leaving them alone. Daniel turned to Eleanor, taking her hands in his. "I love you," he said simply. "I know we have only known each other a few months, but I am certain. I love your strength and your grace and your kindness. I love your sharp mind and your skilled hands and the way you see beauty in difficult things. I want to spend my life with you." Eleanor felt tears pricking her eyes. "I love you too. I think I have loved you since you brought me that lamp, since you cared whether a seamstress you did not know went blind in a rented room." "Then marry me," Daniel said. "Come live here with me. I know you love your sewing and you could continue. You could have a proper room with good light and as many lamps as you want. You could take only the projects that please you, or you could sew only for yourself, only for pleasure. Whatever makes you happy." "What about the ranch? What about it? Would you expect me to help, to work here?" Daniel looked surprised. "Only if you wanted to. Eleanor, I want you as my wife, not as unpaid labor. If you want to be involved in the ranch, I would welcome your help and value your opinions. If you want to focus on your sewing or anything else, that is equally fine. I make enough from the cattle to support us both comfortably. Not luxuriously, but comfortably." "Then yes," Eleanor said. "Yes, I will marry you. I will come live here with you and build a life together." He kissed her then, sweetly and carefully, and Eleanor felt the last of her fear and loneliness fall away. She had been surviving for so long, just getting by day, that she had forgotten what it felt like to actually live, to have hope and plans and someone to share them with. They married in October when the worst of the summer heat had passed, but before the winter cold set in. Mrs. Henderson insisted on hosting the wedding in her home and invited half of Deeming. Eleanor wore a dress she had sewn herself in cream-colored silk that Mrs. Henderson had given her as a wedding gift. Daniel wore a new suit that made him look handsome and slightly uncomfortable, though he relaxed once the ceremony was over and he could remove the tie. The day was perfect. Eleanor stood beside Daniel and made her vows with a full heart, promising to love and honor him for the rest of her life. When he slipped a simple gold band on her finger, she felt as though she was finally becoming herself, finally stepping into the life she was meant to live. That night, Daniel drove them to the ranch under a sky full of stars. Eleanor leaned against his shoulder, wrapped in a blanket against the evening chill, feeling complete in a way she had never experienced before. "Welcome home, Mrs. Grant," Daniel said as he helped her down from the wagon. "Home," Eleanor repeated, tasting the word. "I like the sound of that." The house was small, but Daniel had worked to make it welcoming. There were curtains in the windows, rugs on the floor, furniture that was simple but well made. In what would be their bedroom, he had installed 2 large windows facing east and south to maximize light, and beneath the southern window sat a beautiful sewing table he had built himself, with compartments for supplies and a surface large enough for even the largest quilts. "Daniel," Eleanor whispered, running her hands over the smooth wood. "When did you make this?" "Over the past month. I wanted you to have a proper place to work if you want to work." He came to stand beside her. "I know sewing has been survival for you, but I hope it can become pleasure again. I hope many things can become pleasure instead of just survival." She turned to him and kissed him. "You are the most thoughtful man I have ever known." Their first months of marriage were a time of adjustment and joy. Eleanor learned the rhythms of ranch life, the early mornings and the physical exhaustion, the satisfaction of tending animals and land. She learned to ride, though she never became as comfortable on horseback as Daniel. She learned to cook on the wood stove, to preserve food for winter, to work alongside Maria, the wife of one of Daniel's ranch hands, who became her friend and teacher. She also continued to sew, but now on her own terms. She finished the quilts she had already committed to, then began to be more selective about new projects. She started designing and sewing quilts for the ranch house, for their bed, for the homes of Daniel's workers. She found that when sewing was not a desperate necessity, but a choice, it became something she genuinely loved again. Daniel was a considerate and passionate husband. He worked hard but always made time for Eleanor, for long evening conversations and rides across the ranch, for reading aloud to each other on quiet Sunday afternoons. He valued her opinions about the ranch and often consulted her on decisions, genuinely listening to her ideas. When she suggested they try breeding some of their cattle with a different breed to produce hardier calves, he seriously considered it and eventually agreed, a decision that proved successful. In the spring of their first year of marriage, Eleanor realized she was pregnant. She told Daniel one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, and he let out a whoop of joy that startled the horses in the nearby corral. "A baby," he said, his hands gentle on her still flat stomach. "Our baby. Are you happy?" Eleanor asked, though she could see the answer in his face. "Happier than I have ever been, happier than I knew was possible. He kissed her forehead, her cheeks, her lips. You have given me everything, Eleanor. A home is not just a place. It is you. You are my home. She cried then, happy tears that had been building for months. I was so alone for so long. I thought I would always be alone. And then you brought me a lamp and gave me a lifetime. Their son was born in December, during a cold snap that froze the water in the troughs and made Daniel pace the floor nervously while Maria and Mrs. Henderson attended to Eleanor. The birth was difficult, hours of pain that left Eleanor exhausted, but when she finally held her son, she thought he was worth every moment of suffering. They named him Thomas, after Daniel's father. He was a healthy baby with his father's blue-gray eyes and a loud cry that announced his displeasure with the cold world he had entered. Daniel held him with a wonder that made Eleanor fall in love with her husband all over again, this strong rancher reduced to awed silence by a tiny infant. "He is perfect," Daniel whispered. "Absolutely perfect." Life with a baby was exhausting and wonderful. Eleanor had less time for sewing, but she did not mind. She made small quilts for Thomas, soft blankets embroidered with his name and birth date. She watched Daniel teach their son about the ranch, carrying him outside to see the horses and cattle, talking to him as though he could understand every word. When Thomas was 6 months old, Eleanor was in the garden one afternoon when a rider approached at speed. She recognized one of the ranch hands, looking urgent and alarmed. "Mrs. Grant, come quick. There has been an accident." Her heart stopped. "What happened? Where is Daniel?" "At the north pasture. A cow charged him, knocked him down. He is hurt bad, madam." Eleanor ran for the barn, leaving Thomas with Maria, her hands shaking as she saddled a horse. The ride to the north pasture took 20 minutes that felt like hours. She found Daniel lying in the shade of a cottonwood tree, pale and in obvious pain, with his other worker kneeling beside him. "Daniel!" She was off the horse before it stopped, falling to her knees beside him. "I am all right," he said through gritted teeth, but he was clearly not. His left leg was bent at an unnatural angle and there was a gash on his head that was still bleeding. "His leg is broken," the worker said. "We did not want to move him without you here." "We need to get him to a doctor," Eleanor said, forcing herself to stay calm. "Can we make a travois?" Working together, they fashioned a rough stretcher from branches and blankets and very carefully moved Daniel onto it. The journey back to the ranch house was agonizing, every jolt making Daniel gasp in pain. At the house, Eleanor sent a worker racing to town for the doctor while she cleaned Daniel's head wound and tried to make him comfortable. "I am sorry," Daniel kept saying. "So sorry. I was not careful enough." "Stop apologizing and rest," Eleanor ordered. "You are going to be fine." The doctor arrived several hours later and confirmed that Daniel's leg was broken in 2 places. He set it, splinted it, and left instructions for care and rest. "He was lucky," the doctor said. "It could have been much worse. The break is clean and should heal well if he stays off it." The next weeks were difficult. Daniel was a terrible patient, frustrated by his inability to work, worried about the ranch and the burden his injury placed on Eleanor. But Eleanor managed. She worked with the ranch hands to keep things running, made decisions about cattle and supplies, cared for Daniel and Thomas both. She sewed late into the nights after everyone was asleep, taking comfort in the familiar rhythm of needle through fabric. "I do not know what I would do without you," Daniel said one night as she helped him to bed. His leg was healing but still painful and weak. "You will never have to find out," Eleanor said firmly. "We are partners, Daniel, in good times and bad. You carried me when I needed it, and now I carry you." That is what marriage means. As Daniel healed, they grew even closer, having weathered a crisis together and come through stronger. By spring, he was walking again, though with a slight limp that the doctor said would probably fade with time. He returned to work gradually, listening to Eleanor's advice about taking things slowly. That summer, Mrs. Henderson fell ill with pneumonia. Eleanor brought Thomas to town and stayed with her, nursing her through the worst of the sickness while Daniel managed the ranch alone. It was a near thing, but Mrs. Henderson was tough and stubborn, and she pulled through. "You saved my life," she told Eleanor weakly from her sick bed. "You saved mine first," Eleanor replied. "When you sent Daniel with that lamp, you gave me more than light, Mrs. Henderson. You gave me a future." The years passed in a rhythm of seasons and growth. Thomas grew from baby to toddler to small boy, curious and energetic, happiest when he was outside helping his father with the ranch work. When he was 3, Eleanor gave birth to a daughter they named Clara, a sweet-natured child with Eleanor's dark hair and quick smile. 2 years later came another son, James, completing their family. The ranch prospered under Daniel's management and Eleanor's partnership. The cattle breeding program Eleanor had suggested proved highly successful, and other ranchers began buying their stock. They expanded gradually, buying adjacent land when it became available, improving their house and outbuildings. Eleanor continued to sew, though now mostly for pleasure and for special occasions. She made quilts for each of her children, elaborate works of art that told the story of their family through fabric and thread. She made quilts as gifts for friends, for the church to raffle for charity, for Maria and the other ranch families. One autumn evening when Thomas was 8, Clara was 5, and James was 3, the family gathered on the porch to watch the sunset. The children were playing with a kitten Maria's cat had produced, while Daniel and Eleanor sat side by side in rocking chairs they had bought for their 5th anniversary. "You remember the night we met?" Daniel asked, taking her hand. "Of course. You brought me a lamp because your aunt was worried about my eyes." "I was worried too," he admitted. "I had seen you before, watched you struggling alone, admired your strength, but I was too much a coward to approach until I had an excuse." "You changed my life that night," Eleanor said. "I was just surviving, just getting through each day. I had forgotten what it felt like to hope for anything more." "You changed mine as well," Daniel said. "I had a ranch, land, success of a kind, but I did not have a home, I did not have love, I did not have a reason for any of it." They watched Thomas help Clara chase the kitten while James toddled after them, his laughter high and sweet. The ranch stretched out around them, their kingdom carved from harsh land through hard work and determination. Lights glowed in the windows of their house, warm and welcoming. "I love our life," Eleanor said softly. "I love everything we have built together. Sometimes I still cannot believe this is real, that I am this happy." "Believe it," Daniel said. "You deserve every bit of happiness, Eleanor. You deserve more than I can give you." "You give me everything," she protested. "You give me love and partnership and respect. You give me a home and a family. You give me the freedom to be myself. What more could anyone want?" As darkness fell, they herded the children inside for supper. The kitchen was warm and full of good smells, the table large enough for all of them with room for growth. After the meal, Daniel read to the children from a book of fairy tales while Eleanor sewed by the light of a lamp. Not because she had to, but because she wanted to, because her hands knew the rhythm and found peace in it. When the children were asleep, Daniel and Eleanor stood together in the doorway of their room, looking at the bed covered with one of Eleanor's quilts, at the sewing table by the window, at the life they had made together. "No regrets?" Daniel asked. "Not a single one," Eleanor said. "You gave me a lamp and a lifetime, and I have loved every moment of it." They held each other in the darkness, two people who had been alone and found their way to each other, who had built something real and lasting from hope and hard work. Outside, the New Mexico night was cold and full of stars, but inside there was warmth and light and love enough to last forever. Years continued to unfold like the quilts Eleanor sewed, each one unique, but connected to the pattern of their lives. Thomas grew into a serious young man who loved the ranch as much as his father, often riding out before dawn to check on cattle or mend fences. Clara was artistic like her mother, spending hours drawing and eventually learning to sew, though she lacked Eleanor's patience for the more intricate patterns. James was the wild one, always getting into mischief, bringing home injured animals to nurse, befriending every ranch hand and visitor with his easy charm. When Thomas was 14, Daniel began teaching him the business side of ranching in earnest. They would sit together in the evening going over ledgers and discussing cattle prices, breed improvements, land management. Eleanor would watch them, their heads bent together over the books, and feel a deep satisfaction at the legacy they were building. One spring day when Eleanor was 37 and Daniel 41, Mrs. Henderson passed away peacefully in her sleep. The whole town mourned her, and Eleanor felt the loss keenly. Mrs. Henderson had been the first person in Deeming to show her consistent kindness, to see her as more than just a struggling seamstress. Without Mrs. Henderson's intervention, she and Daniel might never have met. "She would be happy to see how everything turned out," Daniel said as they stood at her graveside. "She always wanted both of us to be happy, to have families of our own." "We should do something to honor her memory," Eleanor said, "something that would have pleased her." After discussing it, they established a fund in Mrs. Henderson's name to help young women in situations like Eleanor had been, alone and struggling. The fund would provide small loans for equipment or training, helping women establish themselves in trades like sewing, baking, or other skills. Eleanor managed the fund, evaluating applications and making decisions about whom to help. The first recipient was a young widow with 3 children who wanted to start a bakery. Eleanor provided her with enough money to buy an oven and supplies. Within 2 years, the bakery was thriving, and the woman was repaying the loan so another woman could be helped. It became a source of pride for Eleanor, a way of passing on the kindness that had changed her own life. When Thomas was 18, he fell in love with Sarah, the daughter of a neighboring rancher. She was a practical, intelligent young woman who had grown up on a ranch and knew the life well. Daniel and Eleanor gave their blessing, and the young couple married the following spring. They built a small house on the eastern edge of Daniel and Eleanor's property, and Thomas continued working the ranch alongside his father. 2 years later, Clara surprised everyone by announcing she wanted to go to California to study art. "I love you all," she said, tears streaming down her face. "But I need to see if I can make something of my drawing, if I can be an artist." Daniel was initially opposed, worried about his daughter traveling alone to a distant state, but Eleanor convinced him. "We cannot hold her back from her dreams just because we are afraid. We raised her to be strong and independent. Now we have to trust that." They sent Clara to stay with Daniel's sister in San Francisco, and she enrolled in an art school there. Her letters home were full of excitement about her classes and the city and the opportunities she was discovering. Eleanor missed her terribly, but was proud of her daughter's courage. James, at 16, announced he wanted to be a veterinarian. He had always been the one to doctor sick calves and injured horses, and it made sense. The nearest veterinary school was in Denver, but that was still 2 years away, time for him to mature and prepare. As her children grew and began their own lives, Eleanor found herself with more time. She expanded her sewing, not for money but for art. She created elaborate quilts that told stories in fabric, landscapes and portraits and abstract designs that challenged her skills, and satisfied her creative urges. She began entering them in county and territorial fairs, winning prizes and recognition. One autumn, a buyer from a fancy hotel in Santa Fe saw one of her quilts at the territorial fair. He approached her about creating a series of quilts depicting New Mexico landscapes for the hotel's guest rooms. The commission would pay extraordinarily well and would give her work a wider audience. "What do you think?" she asked Daniel that evening. "It would mean spending most of my time sewing for months." "I think you should do it if it makes you happy," Daniel said. "You have spent years supporting my dreams and our family. You deserve to pursue your own dreams as well." Eleanor accepted the commission and spent the next year creating 12 quilts, each depicting a different New Mexico landscape. The desert at sunset, the mountains in winter, the Rio Grande in summer, the ancient pueblos, the vast grasslands. When she delivered them to the hotel, the owner was overwhelmed. "These are not just quilts," he said. "These are works of art. I want to commission more, and I want to display them in our lobby where everyone can see them." Word spread, and soon Eleanor had more commissions than she could accept. She began to be selective, choosing only projects that genuinely interested her artistically. Money, which had once been so scarce and precious, was no longer a concern. The ranch was successful, and her sewing brought in additional income. She could pick and choose, creating only what pleased her. When Thomas and Sarah's first child was born, a boy they named Daniel after his grandfather, Eleanor created a special quilt for him. It depicted the ranch in all seasons, a visual history of the land his family worked. She added small details: a figure on horseback that was clearly Daniel, a woman in a garden that was Eleanor, children playing by the creek. It was a map of their family's story told in fabric and thread. Daniel held the quilt and studied it carefully, his weathered fingers tracing the stitches. "This is us," he said quietly. "This is our life. You captured it perfectly." "We built something good," Eleanor said. "Something worth capturing." Clara came home for a visit when she was 23, bringing with her a young man she introduced as her fiancé. Marcus was an architect, intelligent and kind, clearly devoted to Clara. They married in a small ceremony in San Francisco, but came back to the ranch for a celebration with the family. "I never thought I would leave the ranch," Clara admitted to her mother during the visit. "But I am happy, Mama. I love Marcus, and I love my work, and I have built a life that fits me." "That is all any parent can hope for," Eleanor said. "That their children find lives that fit them, that make them happy." James did go to veterinary school in Denver, excelling in his studies. He wrote home regularly, full of enthusiasm about what he was learning. When he graduated, he returned to New Mexico and set up a practice in Deeming, caring for the cattle, horses, and other animals of the surrounding ranches. His childhood love of healing animals had become his life's work. Daniel and Eleanor grew older together gracefully. Their hair grayed, their bodies moved more slowly, but their love deepened and matured like fine wine. They had weathered storms together: the injury that had nearly crippled Daniel, the sickness that had almost taken Mrs. Henderson, the struggles of raising children, the lean years when cattle prices dropped and money was tight. On their 25th wedding anniversary, their children and grandchildren gathered at the ranch for a celebration. Thomas and Sarah had 3 children now. Clara and Marcus had 2, though they still lived in California. James was newly married to a teacher from Deeming. The house was full of noise and laughter and life. After dinner, Eleanor presented Daniel with a quilt she had been working on in secret for months. It depicted their wedding day, showing the two of them standing together in Mrs. Henderson's parlor, their whole lives ahead of them. Around the border, She had embroidered the dates and names of their children and grandchildren, a testament to the family they had created. Daniel could not speak. He held the quilt and wept openly, not ashamed of his tears. "How did I get so lucky?" he finally managed. "How did a rough cowboy like me end up with such riches?" "The same way a lonely seamstress ended up with a home and a family," Eleanor said. "We found each other, we chose each other. We built this together." That night, after everyone had gone to bed, Daniel and Eleanor sat on their porch as they had done countless times before. The ranch was quiet except for the normal night sounds. Cattle lowing in the distance, horses moving in the corrals, the wind in the cottonwood trees. "Do you remember that first night?" Daniel asked. "When I brought you the lamp?" "Every detail," Eleanor said. "I was so tired and so alone, working by candlelight, wondering if that was all my life would ever be. And then you knocked on my door with a gift from your aunt." "I was terrified," Daniel admitted. "You were so beautiful and so self-contained. I thought you would send me away." "I almost did," Eleanor confessed. "I had learned not to trust kind gestures from men, but there was something about you, something in your eyes that made me take a chance." "Best chance I ever took," Daniel said. "Asking you to let me show you how to use that lamp. Best chance I ever took was saying yes." They sat in comfortable silence, holding hands, watching the stars wheel overhead. Tomorrow would bring new work and new challenges, but tonight there was only peace and contentment and the deep satisfaction of a life well lived. As the years advanced, Daniel began to slow down more noticeably. His limp from the old injury became more pronounced in cold weather. He tired more easily and had to leave more of the physical work to Thomas and the hired hands. He chafed against his limitations at first, but Eleanor helped him accept them. "You built something that can run without you breaking your back every day," she reminded him. "You raised a son who is fully capable of managing this ranch. That was always the goal, was it not? To create something that would outlast us, I suppose," Daniel admitted. "But it is hard to step back." "You are not stepping back. You are stepping into a new role, advisor instead of manager. Grandfather instead of father. We are entering a new season of life, Daniel. Let us embrace it." And he did. He spent more time with his grandchildren, teaching them to ride and rope, telling them stories of the early days when the ranch was just an idea and a spring in the desert. He sat with Eleanor in the evenings, reading or simply enjoying her company, no longer feeling the constant pressure to be working. Eleanor continued to sew, though her eyes were not what they once were despite the good light from multiple lamps. She used stronger spectacles and worked on less intricate patterns, but her creativity never dimmed. She began teaching some of the ranch women and her granddaughters to sew, passing on skills and techniques, creating a legacy beyond the quilts themselves. One winter evening, when Daniel was 62 and Eleanor 58, they sat by the fire in their comfortable living room. Snow was falling outside, unusual for New Mexico, but not unheard of. The room was warm and cozy, and Eleanor was hand-stitching binding on a small quilt she had made for their newest grandchild. "Eleanor," Daniel said suddenly, "I need you to know something." She looked up, alarmed by the seriousness in his tone. "What is it?" "I have been thinking about my life, about what matters, and I realize that every good thing I have, every joy I have experienced, traces back to you. You made my house a home. You gave me children and grandchildren. You made me a better man than I would have been alone." He paused. "I know I do not say it enough, but I love you more now than I did on our wedding day, and I loved you tremendously then." Eleanor set down her sewing and went to him, settling onto the arm of his chair so she could put her arms around him. "I love you too. You saved my life, Daniel. Not just by bringing me a lamp, though that was important. You saved me by seeing me, by valuing me, by giving me a reason to hope. Everything good in my life comes from the night you knocked on my door." They held each other while the snow fell outside and the fire crackled. Two people who had found each other against all odds and built something beautiful together. Daniel lived another 8 years, dying peacefully in his sleep at age 70. He simply went to bed one night and never woke up, which Eleanor thought was the best way for a man who had worked so hard his whole life. The funeral was large, attended by ranchers from all over the territory, by townspeople from Deeming, by all their children and grandchildren. Thomas continued running the ranch successfully, making Daniel proud in his final years by proving himself a worthy successor. Clara and her family came from California and stayed for 2 months, helping Eleanor adjust to widowhood. James checked on his mother every day, making sure she was eating and sleeping and not giving in to grief. But Eleanor did not give in. She grieved, certainly. She missed Daniel terribly, missed his presence and his voice and his steady companionship. But she also felt grateful for the years they had shared, for the love they had built, for everything they had created together. She continued living at the ranch, though Thomas and Sarah tried to convince her to move into the main house with them. "I like my space," she told them. "I like my memories. This house is full of Daniel, and I am not ready to leave it." She filled her days with sewing and grandchildren and managing the fund she had established in Mrs. Henderson's name. She continued creating quilts, though now they were often memorial pieces, commemorating people and events. She made one for Daniel, a complex pattern that captured his strength and kindness and the life they had shared. At night, she would light the lamps in her sewing room, the descendants of the first lamp Daniel had brought her so long ago. She would sew by their steady light, remembering a young cowboy who had cared whether a struggling seamstress went blind, who had brought her more than light, who had given her a lifetime of love. Eleanor lived to be 82, sharp and active until nearly the end. She saw her grandchildren marry and have children of their own. She saw the ranch continue to prosper under Thomas's management. She saw her quilts hanging in hotels and homes across the territory and beyond, her art recognized and valued. On the day she died, she was surrounded by family in the house she and Daniel had shared for so many years. Clara had come from California. James was there with his wife. Thomas held one of her hands while Sarah held the other. Grandchildren and great-grandchildren filled the room. "Tell me about the lamp," one of her great-granddaughters asked, a child of perhaps 9 who loved hearing the old stories. Eleanor smiled, her voice thin but clear. "Your great-grandfather brought me a lamp on the night we met. I was sewing by candlelight, ruining my eyes, and he came to my door with a gift from his aunt. A simple oil lamp, but it changed everything. Suddenly I could see clearly. Suddenly the future seemed brighter. And then you fell in love," the child said. "And then we fell in love," Eleanor agreed. "He gave me light, and I gave him a home, and together we made a life that was richer than either of us could have imagined alone." She closed her eyes, tired but content. Her last thoughts were of Daniel, of that first night when a kind cowboy had knocked on her door with a lamp and a smile, changing the course of her life forever. She had been sewing quilts by candlelight, struggling and alone. He had given her a lamp and a lifetime, and it had been more than enough. Thomas made sure his mother was buried beside his father in the small cemetery on the ranch property, overlooking the land they had built together. On her gravestone he had carved, "Eleanor Grant, beloved wife and mother, artist and friend, she turned scraps into beauty and darkness into light." The family gathered at the ranch after the funeral, and Thomas brought out a large trunk. Mother left instructions that this was to be opened after her death, with all of us present. Inside the trunk were quilts, dozens of them, each tagged with a name. Every child, grandchild, and great-grandchild had a quilt made specifically for them, depicting something meaningful from their lives or their relationships with Eleanor. There were quilts for children not yet born, for future generations, each one a work of art and love. "She must have spent years making these," Sarah whispered, holding up a quilt meant for their youngest grandson. "She spent her whole life making these," Clara said, understanding. "This is who she was, taking scraps and thread and love and making something beautiful that would last." At the bottom of the trunk was one final quilt, wrapped carefully and tagged with Thomas's name and instructions that it was to remain at the ranch house always. Thomas unfolded it carefully, and everyone gathered close to see. It was a masterpiece, the finest work Eleanor had ever done. It showed the ranch from above, as though seen by a bird flying overhead. Every building, every pasture, every tree was depicted in perfect detail. And throughout the quilt, woven into the landscape, were figures. Daniel and Eleanor, young and old, working and resting and living. Their children at various ages, grandchildren and great-grandchildren, the hired hands and neighbors and friends who had populated their lives. In one corner, stitched in Eleanor's careful hand, was an inscription. "This is the life we built together, from a lamp and a hope and a love that lasted a lifetime. Treasure it and tend it and pass it on, so that others may know what is possible when two people choose each other and do not give up." The family stood together, looking at the quilt that captured their history and their legacy. The ranch spread out around them, solid and real, a testament to what Daniel and Eleanor had created. The sun was setting, painting the sky in the same gold and rose colors Eleanor had captured in her quilts so many times. "They did it," James said quietly. "They took nothing and made all this. They built something that will outlast them." "They built something that will outlast all of us," Clara corrected. "This is not just land and cattle. This is family and love and legacy. This is proof that good things can come from hard times, that two lonely people can find each other and make magic." As darkness fell, lights came on in the ranch buildings, warm and welcoming, the descendants of that first lamp still providing illumination and hope. The family gathered for dinner, sharing stories of Daniel and Eleanor, laughing and crying and remembering. And somewhere in the fabric of the universe, two souls who had found each other in the harsh New Mexico territory of 1883 rested together, their love story complete, their legacy secure, their light still shining through the generations they had created. The ranch continued for another century under the stewardship of Thomas's descendants, always with Eleanor's final quilt hanging in the main house, a reminder of where they came from and what mattered most. And in museums and private collections across the country, Eleanor's quilts continued to inspire and delight, each one a testament to the fact that beauty and hope can emerge from the darkest circumstances, that love can transform simple materials into art, and that a single act of kindness, a lamp brought to a struggling seamstress on a long-ago night, can ripple forward through time, changing countless lives and creating a legacy that never fades.